Thanks for listening to this archive of Teaching American History's first Documents in Detail webinar for 2021. This episode aired live on January 20th, and the focus of the episode was Andrew Jackson's veto message regarding the National Bank. Dr. John Moser, as always, was our moderator, and we were joined by Dr. Dennis Bowman and Dr. Dan Monroe. You can find more information about this at tah.org. Thanks so much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I am Professor of History and Chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. And I would like to welcome you to another episode of Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically significant documents. We encourage all of you joining us today to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Within the next week, you'll be receiving an email with a link to click on to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from our book, 50 Core American Documents. If you are not familiar with that book, you should be. You can get a copy of that via tah.org. Also at tah.org, you will find our voluminous document database, where all the documents that you can find in that book can be downloaded individually. The subject of tonight's program is Andrew Jackson's 1832 veto message of the bill on the Bank of the United States. And to help discuss that are Dr. Dan Monroe, Chair and Associate Professor of History at Millikan University, and Dr. Dennis Bowman, who teaches courses on history and the humanities at Lindenwood University and American Intercontinental University. Both of these individuals are faculty members in Ashland University's master's program in American History and Government. We are delighted to have you both here, Dan and Dennis.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'd like to start out these things by asking a general question about why this deserves to be included in a book called 50 Core American Documents. Although neither of you is the editor of that volume. You had no say over what into that volume. However, I'm asking you to defend its inclusion nonetheless.
Yeah. You want me to go ahead, Dan?
Sure.
I'll just begin by saying I think it's an important document because it's one that really shows a real boost in executive authority in the United States. Jackson began to veto bills that probably normally would not have been vetoed. He believed that it was bad policy. It was not necessarily unconstitutional in every respect, what was included in the bank bill. But for that reason, and that was one of the major issues that had been knocking around since 1791, when the first Bank of the United States bill was actually brought before Congress, and James Madison began to argue that indeed it was not a constitutional measure, that it violated the Constitution, and this issue would knock around for all the way up to 1832, and Andrew Jackson, of course, I think. Really, one of his major reasons for opposing the bill was because it was a political measure. It was brought by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and others who really wanted to use the issue as a presidential campaign issue. Henry Clay was preparing to run for president. And so all of these things come together and show that indeed it's a significant document. And many of the issues that are argued are still, I think, pertinent today. How we look at the Constitution, whether we think that certain things are constitutional or not, often come back to many of the same arguments that Jackson and others were making at this time. So,
yeah, I would just add to that. That was great summary. Jackson sounds the class warfare note in his veto message very strongly, arguing that the bank bill was a measure designed to privilege the rich at the expense of the poor. And we just had the end today of a kind of populist-driven presidency. I think it's fair to say, and I think Jackson's one of the precursors of that kind of approach. He took an issue that really was in many respects an issue about related to a developing economy, and made it into a kind of class warfare issue, and it worked. After all, Jackson beats Clay in 32 rather handily, in part, as Dennis pointed out, in part because Clay and Nicholas Biddle, the president of the bank, stupidly made the bank an issue in the presidential campaign, and then Jackson beat them over the head with it, using class warfare as essentially you've read his bank veto message as a subject tonight. It's rather long and includes a variety of arguments, but really the money line, so to speak, is his class warfare paragraph at the end of the message, where he hammers away at the privileged elite. This is really the theme, as you all know. This was really the theme of Jackson's presidency, was that Washington had been taken over by a kind of ossified elite, and he was the common man coming in to clean the proverbial Aegean stables.
So help me out, gentlemen. I'm a 20th century guy. This is not my area of expertise. Perhaps you could say something about the context for this, and something about the background of the bank issue and how it got to this stage. Right. This is Jackson dealing the death blow. I'm hoping that toward the end we can talk about the effects of this veto, but for now, just help us set the stage.
Okay, I'll just start. Well, one of the things that's very interesting is that some of the arguments that are used in this veto message, which were primarily drafted by, I think, Amos Kendall and Roger B. Tawney, is that they look back at the first Bank of the United States debate, and in particular, they honed in on the arguments of James Madison that he brought before the House of Representatives against the bill. And one of the things that he argued was that indeed Congress did not have the powers to establish an incorporated national bank. He argued that it was not part of the enumerated powers, which it's obviously not, nor should it be part of the implied powers that are mentioned at the end of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which says that Congress shall make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by Congress by the Constitution in the government and departments and officers thereof. So Madison argues, and this becomes known as the strict constructionist argument, that indeed you should very, very carefully interpret the Constitution and not allow all of these implied powers to come in. And this is the main argument that Madison makes. And it's the argument that almost prevails. Washington was really unclear about whether or not this was a constitutional power. Even though he was the president of the convention in 1787, he did not really trust his own judgment on these kind of matters. And indeed, there was a great deal of disagreement among the delegates to the convention. And so it really is an important issue about how you interpret the Constitution and how far you go in actually allowing Congress to use the implied powers to bring about the enumerated powers. Things like if you're going to raise an army, for instance, there's no mention in the Constitution about how Congress is to do that. Are they to to enlist people? Are they to draft them? Are they to have an all volunteer service, whatever it might be? So these are really important issues. And so by 1832, when it's almost time to go ahead and recharter the Second Bank of the United States or not, this issue comes to the fore again. And it's a very important issue also because it's going to have a big impact upon the economy of the country. The country is still largely undeveloped economically. And so if you don't have a national bank available to foster that kind of development, I think it's a serious problem. And so this is another issue that I think is important about it.
Yeah, and the proof of that is after Jackson kills the bank, the country goes into recession in 37. I mean, almost immediately. The bank was supposed to be chartered through 36. And because of Clay and Biddle's incredible lack of political judgment, they forced a recharter 4 years early and got their heads handed to them. But I would just add to Dennis's comments about context. I mean, the so-called bank war goes on in the backdrop of Jackson's very personalized, however you want to characterize it, presidency, dominated by his fiery personality and his kind of populist approach to things. I mean, this is the Jacksonian age that Lincoln famously condemned in the Lyceum Address and elsewhere, an emphasis on emotion, on intuiting, rather than the rationalism of the 18th century, the Jeffersonian rationalism. The idea that Jackson argued that when he came into office, that positions of government could be held by any person. They didn't have to have, a kind of William and Mary education or be part of the powdered wig set. And if they didn't have a proper education, they would simply intuit the how to be the Secretary of the Treasury or how to be the Assistant Secretary of State. So the reason I mention this is that bank war is driven in part by Jackson's kind of visceral hatred for banking. As Dennis pointed out, the national bank was something that was desperately needed in the developing economy of the United States. I mean, the national bank provided, its signal service was, it provided a medium of exchange that was reliable. In an age where state banks, went bankrupt every other day, and when they issued script or paper money, or script that passed as paper money, it would become valueless. So you could be engaged in a transaction, have someone pay you in state bank script, and then realize 2 weeks later, oh, this stuff is worthless now. Whereas the national bank currency, because it was the depository of the federal government, was reliable. Everybody knew if you got national bank script, it was going to hold its value. But Jackson had bad experiences in the 1790s, early in his career, where he had gotten in transactions bad script or script from banks that had gone under. And after that, he simply distrusted any kind of paper instrument. He wanted to be paid in hard money. Well, there was not enough hard, in a developing economy, but by its definition, there's never going to be enough coin circulating. So the result was you either use paper or you're back to barter. So the point is that, Jackson's personalized presidency, because of his prejudice, his kind of old fogeyism on, economic growth and economic issues, the country loses the national bank. And he did a terrible disservice, I think.
So it is fair to say then that Jackson really, while he is politically savvy, he really doesn't know what he's talking about here when he discusses banking.
I think that's true. And I have to say, not only is he ignorant about, I think Jackson understood that the bank had its advantages, but once the bank gets tied up with Biddle and Clay, he can't make the leap to, well, it's probably good for the country, even if it helps Biddle and Clay. Therefore, I'll do what's good for the country. No, if it helps Biddle and Clay, they're my enemies. I hate them with a visceral hatred and always will. So I'm opposed to that. I mean, McLean, his cabinet officials, Secretary of Treasury early on, John McLean had I think convinced him to go along with a recharter. But once, Dennis was pointing out, I think very sagaciously, that who's the author of this ponderous veto message? Well, Roger Taney. Roger Taney was one of the authors. I mean, there was a number of authors, but Taney, who was a very partisan Democrat, and as we all know, basically did one lousy, rotten thing in American politics as long as he was on Earth, right? So this is another of his handiworks. In other words, Taney and partisan Democrats convinced Jackson not to support recharter, and Biddle and Clay played right into that.
Oh, that's
Well,
really interesting. Go ahead, Dennis.
I was just going to say it's ironic that Taney was one of the co-authors of that message, because it's later that Lincoln actually uses some of the clauses from this veto bill in his criticism of the Dred Scott case in his June 26, 1857 speech that he gave in Springfield, where he uses that famous phrase where Taney or whoever it was that wrote it, that Congress, the executive, and the court must be guided by each by its own opinion of the Constitution. In other words, that the Supreme Court was not the sole determiner of the Constitution. And so those words come back to haunt Taney later, whether he knew it or not. But
that leads us directly to a question by Joe Rooney. Our statement more. My understanding of the significance of the veto message was that Jackson asserted that the bank was unconstitutional, contrary to the ruling of the Supreme Court in McCulloch v. Maryland. Right. Thus, he asserted the right of the president independently to determine the constitutionality of the bank, a view which Jackson actually shared with Lincoln, that the Supreme Court was not the end of the story in terms of constitutionality. Can you comment on that?
Well, I guess I could. Yeah, I think that one of the concerns that many Americans from this period had over the power of the Supreme Court was that it could become a oligarchy over the entire country by handing down decisions that would determine the direction of policy, often, or the killing of policy, or the allowance of certain policies that people felt were unconstitutional. And indeed, that's one of the things that Lincoln said in his first inaugural, was that you can't allow the Supreme Court to have the final say on everything. Otherwise, we'll just be the subjects to this despotism. And it's an interesting point. It's one that I think is well considered. I think that we have to be really careful how far we want to go with that. But I do think that that, as Lincoln and many others believed, that just one decision by the court should not be determinate. He argued that there really need to be a series of decisions unless the entire people of the United States, almost in a unanimous way, accepted the decision. And indeed, it should be reiterated over time. And once that had happened, and it was clear that it was a solid decision by the court, and that there were no shenanigans, no misrepresentation of the facts or the law in the decision, then of course it should become settled precedent. But one decision does not make a settled precedent, according to Jackson and many, including Lincoln. So I think there was some agreement with that, though it should be noted that both Daniel Webster and Henry Clay very much disagreed with that. And in their congressional speeches against the veto bill, veto message, it's clear that indeed, at least Clay and Webster did not think that this should be the way that you proceed with when you have a definitive decision by the court.
Yeah, I would just add that Joe is, in his question, is right, and Dennis as well. I mean, Jackson's argument was that he was the one officer in the United States that was elected by all the people. Therefore, the presidency was kind of unique, and should be, carried out in a kind of robust way, rather than the retiring way that I think, or maybe less robust. I mean, however you want to characterize it, I think that the founders intended, where Congress was paramount. I think Jackson viewed the presidency, because of its special character, as a place of very vigorous action. I mean, the fact that he vetoed more bills than all of his predecessors combined, that, as Dennis said, he argued that the president can determine the constitutionality of bills, of legislation, and doesn't necessarily have to simply, rest on Supreme Court decisions. And there are countless other examples of that. And that interpretation is also very in keeping with Jackson's personality as well.
Well, and it sounds like the sort of arguments that almost 100 years later, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson would make about the nature of the presidency.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, and it's one that, I mean, one of our colleagues in this program, Stephen Knott, has written a very fine book on the presidency, and argues that it's kind of, as an institution, it's kind of gone off the rails, in the sense that it's become a much more expansive thing than the founders envisioned. Well, this is, you could make the argument this is the beginning of that. That Jackson's very robust. I mean, his approach to the presidency was regarded as so aggressive that you've all seen. I thought about bringing it to this session, the famous wood cutting of King Andrew I, where he's clothed in this royal raven. He's got a crown. He's got like a scepter, and he's and that was his approach to the presidency was so controversial it spawned an entire political party. I mean, the whole raison d'etre of the Whig Party was, in part, Jackson's out of control. He's becoming a kind of king / dictator / despot.
It's customary for me during these webinars to ask what the author or speaker's intellectual influences were. Does Jackson have these, or is he sui generis?
Well, he's certainly sui generis, but he's also somebody who I think considered himself to have been at least influenced by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. I think that he probably would have looked at those two men, though he disagreed with them very strongly about certain aspects of their exercise of executive power. But I think that he very much was part of that group of men who believed that the Constitution should be strictly and very carefully interpreted, and that powers should be limited unless there's a really good reason to expand them. And so it seems kind of flies in the face of the way that he exercised his powers as president. But perhaps the reason for that is that he wanted to see when he was in the office anyway, presidential power expanded, and to have much more say in congressional lawmaking, which is one of the things that he complains about in this bill, in this message. And I think that is where he really just believes that he should have a greater say in the making of legislation. And indeed, he complains that the congressman didn't come to him and ask him what would work and what wouldn't, and what he would accept. Of course, that probably never entered into their mind, because you hadn't had a president who vetoed bills like Jackson went on to do. So,
Dan, anything you care to add to that?
No, I think that's right. Jefferson and Madison, I think Jackson thought of himself as a kind of old school Republican with a small R, right. A states' rights man. But I think that he was used to running the show. He had been a military officer. And once he became president of the United States, it is an executive position. He started flexing his muscles. He was it's always important to bear in mind too, and this is somewhat of a parallel to the present, although I'm always reluctant to say, today is like 2020. It just frustrates me when people say, oh, this is exactly like 1860. No, actually it isn't freaking remotely like that. I'm trying to watch my language here. There is a parallel in this sense, and that is Jackson was the head of a movement. Remember after Jackson was, in his view, cheated out of the presidency in 1824, he spent the next 4 years essentially building a political movement. The raison d'etre of what was we was robbed, and we have to restore Jackson to the presidency that he was cheated out of, and they succeeded immensely in 28. And so he creates. I mean, it has to be borne in mind. Jackson's really the creator of the modern Democratic Party. I mean, it's Jackson with help from Van Buren and Calhoun who create, organize what becomes the Democratic Party, and the themes of the Democratic Party in the Jacksonian period persist. I mean, it's one of the reasons why when Franklin Roosevelt was elected in the 1930s, speaking of parallels, they have Jackson Day dinners, and there's lots of talk about Jackson. And Arthur Schlesinger publishes a ponderous book on the Jacksonian age, and everybody reads it on the troop ships going over to Europe. And Jackson's a hero to the 1930s Democratic Party. Well, why? In part because of the message, the economic populist message, right here in this bank veto.
Okay, we've got a bunch of questions from our attendees. One from an anonymous attendee. Do you think that Jackson...
Is it from West Palm Beach?
I don't know. A healthy start to a post-presidential career, I think.
That's right. He's checking in.
This webinar. Do you think that Jackson partially did this, that is, vetoed the bank, to get back at Congress, and in particular Clay, after the messy end to the 1824 election?
Well, I let me just jump in, Dennis, is it all right with you? I don't think that's the only reason, but I think that was part of his calculus. I mean, the famous anecdote in all the biographies is, Van Buren comes back from England after the Senate doesn't confirm him as minister, so he had to come back, and he goes to the White House to see Jackson, and he's sitting there smoking his enormous pipe surrounded by smoke. Robert Remini does a great description of this in his magnificent biography of Jackson. And Van Buren says, "Hey, what's going on?" And Jackson says, words to that effect. And Jackson says, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Right? Well, in other words, he personalizes, every dispute, it's back to the dueling ground. But having said that, and I'll let Dennis jump in here too. I would say that there's certainly an element of spite in it. I mean, that was part of Jackson's argument about the presidency was, well, if I want to veto a bill, I'm going to do it. And I don't have to, just because it's, I don't have to cite the Constitution. I can veto it out of spite. I can do what I want because I'm the president. So I think that was part of it, but I also think that there were other reasons.
Dennis?
I think that the major, and we've already mentioned it somewhat about the class warfare rhetoric that Jackson used. I think one of the things that's important to remember is that there were a lot of Americans who were very concerned about the fact that you had certain elite people who had the ears of congressmen and could gain bills, have bills actually drafted and passed for them. And the Bank of the United States was one of those bills that they looked to and said, look at all of these elite people who are benefiting from the passage of this bill. And look at what they're trying to do again. In 1832, they're trying to pass a bill which will give great amounts of money to a select few individuals and give them a great deal of power over the economy. And that just seems to be very counter to the Republican, little r, Republican ideals of that age. And the idea that you would have the concentration of power politically and financially in the hands of a few people was just was anathema to those people who held that government should be small and it should be limited. And I think that as much as anything was what was driving Jackson's rhetoric here. And I think it's an important aspect of it that has to be kept in mind.
I would just add to that just briefly, and then I'll shut up. Dennis makes a great point about the corruption angle. Webster and others were on retainer from the bank, and everyone was aware of this. So it was not necessarily a secret. I mean, in other words, people knew that certain congressmen were taking money from the bank and presenting the bank's views.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't Webster one of the lawyers in the McCullough versus Maryland case?
I think so.
And he argued on the side of the bank. So
right.
he was well identified with the bank. And I think that was very detrimental because, of course, Dark Dan, as he was referred to back then, was very much part of the nobility of New England and was considered to be this very important orator and politician and somebody who had deep connections, a very wide network to all of the elite in the United States, it seemed, at least in the northern part of the United States and in New England. So he was identified with those elite against whom Jackson railed. And I think that's an important aspect of it as well.
Mitchell Behrens asks, while Jackson did have some hatred towards the bank, I think he still would have vetoed the bill if non-landowners were kept from voting. It seems like it would have cost him the election.
I mean, I'll take a pass at it, and then Dennis can chime in too. I don't. If you look at the veto message, he has a litany of objections to the bank, and I think so. I think that once the bank became a political issue, I think if the bank had been kept out of the 32 election, Jackson might have accepted a bank with modifications. I mean, Jackson had told his Secretary of Treasury early in his term, well, I don't really like the bank, but if certain modifications were made to meet my objections, he didn't really say he would sign it, but he left the door open. Well, once it became a political issue, all of his old prejudices returned in force. Not that they were ever gone, but so I guess my answer to the question would be, I don't see Jackson signing it in 32 under any circumstances.
Dennis.
Yeah, I think it's clear that he probably would have signed the bill if it hadn't been presented into those circumstances. In fact, there was somebody, I've forgotten the name of the individual, but he was a friend of the bank who had actually been negotiating with Jackson before this bank bill came before Congress. And Jackson had been persuaded to go along with the recharter of the bill after certain
changes have been made.
Changes that he wanted were made, and so that agreement was completely nullified once Jackson learned that Clay and Webster and Biddle and others were trying to use this as a political issue to defeat him in the 1832 election. So I think that there was no way that he was going to go along with that once that happened.
Barry Davis asks, I know that Congress would censure Jackson for his actions after the veto. Was there any effort to impeach Jackson?
Do you know, Dan?
No,
I don't think so.
No, nothing along those lines, although as the questioner points out, he was censured. And then the Democrats uncensured him. Right. It's actually, if you look at the annals of Congress, they actually took a black, ink and X'd out the censure resolution. That was, they took this very seriously. Jackson, after he leaves the presidency, writes, dozens of letters to Democratic congressmen saying, hey, get on this uncensure or decensure, however you want to characterize it, motion. In other words, he lobbied them intensely to erase what he regarded as a stain on his legacy, and eventually they accomplished it.
Yeah, I believe he also was fined, wasn't he? And that fine was restored to him. I may be mistaken about that, but I think that's right.
Yeah, he was fined. That was after the what is this on 1814? He was fined $1,000, and I think the Congress remitted that to him during this period. Yeah.
Yeah, just before his death. It wasn't very long before his death when this happened, I think.
Yes.
Nadia Mashaj asks, would Jackson have not vetoed the bill if he had seen the quote modifications of the bank charter which are necessary to make it compatible with justice unquote? I think this is sort of what you got at before. It seems like he was not necessarily against the bank, but against what he saw as certain monopolistic aspects of the charter.
Right, and I think he makes the same argument in his veto message that one of the main reasons he objects to the bill is because it establishes once again a national bank with a monopoly over the entire country in a way that, as far as financial affairs go and the control over the state banks, that is deemed by him and many others is to be dangerous. And what he really wanted to do, and this is the same suggestion that James Madison made in 1791, by the way, so I think this is where they got it, was to have regional banks, several of them, not just one large national bank, but to have several regional banks that would be connected to the federal government, and that would be much safer than trying to establish this all-encompassing national bank that was created in 1791 and again in 1816 and tried to do in 1832.
I would just throw in too, one thing that we haven't mentioned about the veto message. It does have a strong condemnation of foreign ownership of bank stock. And, we're talking about populism and how this has elements of populist themes. Well, that's another one. I mean, there's, Jackson starts out in that message beating a kind of nativist drum by saying, well, what happens if foreigners control our national bank and we go to war with the nation that is filled with stockholders of the bank would take the side of our foe. I mean, it's kind of, and I often tell my students, well, do we want to have overseas investment in Caterpillar or not? I mean, what, in other words, if Brits and Germans want to buy Caterpillar stock, that's all to the good. That helps Caterpillar capitalize. And then they use that money to build factories and widgets and gadgets and hire people. So, but Jackson plays it, I mean, really right out of the gate, he's playing a populist theme. I mean, he hammers foreign ownership, in the specter of foreigners kind of in effect controlling the national money supply, or what, was, for lack of a better institution, was the national medium of exchange.
Yeah, and another thing about that that's interesting is that Clay, in his answer to Jackson, actually points out that it's a good thing to have the influx of foreign capital into the country through these subscribers and shareholders, and that it's a beneficial thing to see that money flowing into our coffers instead of remaining in England. And so it's really kind of a counterproductive kind of argument that Jackson is making here. I think he doesn't understand finance very well. If he did, he wouldn't have made these arguments. At least that's my impression.
It seems to me that
absolutely.
It seems to me that foreign investment in the United States reduces the chance of those countries wanting to go to war against the United States.
Yeah.
Right? John McKay asks, in your opinions, was the veto of the bank a worthwhile sacrificial lamb to allow for a stronger presidency that was capable of balancing the power of Congress and the Supreme Court?
I'll just jump in if it's okay. I have, and this is why I was called the big wig in grad school. I mean, I think it was a terrible mistake, to kill the bank. It does. I mean, there's all kinds of evidence that it harms economic development. The Panic of '37 being a classic example. It creates a kind of cumbersome sub-treasury system, which doesn't work very well. And then we're kind of back to the state banks flailing about. To me, the two problems for a developing economy are labor supply, never enough labor, and money supply. Money always chasing economic development, and that's why you get inflation. You get, and so there was never, or in some cases, deflation. But the point is, you've got to have in antebellum America, you needed a medium of exchange. Barter wasn't enough anymore, if it had ever been, and there was never enough coin. So I'm all in favor of a robust presidency within constitutional parameters or boundaries. But my answer would be no. I don't think there was anything good about it. But I'm happy to listen to others.
I tend to agree with Dan about that. I think that it really gets the constitutional system out of balance when you give so much power to one of the branches, which I think is what's happened as we've seen the rot set in, if you want to call it that, over the decades, because now the president does so many things on his own, which is not the way that our constitutional system was set up. It was meant to have a balance of power between the three branches, as well as between the national government and the state governments. And we've pretty much lost that. Congress and the president now control so much of our governance, and the states are getting smaller and smaller in many respects in the powers that they have. And so I'm not sure that it's a good thing that happened. So I might disagree a little bit with the premise of that question. But Jackson did some very good things, but I think that fortunately he was able to hem in his emotions somewhat during the nullification crisis, though it looked like we might have an early civil war at that point with this guy. So great power means that you can do great things, but also you can do a lot of bad things too, and you can cause a lot of havoc if you don't know what you're doing, or if you just go by your emotions, which is one of the problems that Jackson had, I think.
Marion Broglie asks, who was the intended audience of the veto message? Did Jackson intend his populist attack on the bank to be read by the common people? After all, it's a pretty weighty message, and it's fairly technical. Would you say that the common people of the 1830s were more astute than present day Americans?
I don't know if I would say they were more astute, but I do think that politics in the 1830s was the national sport. And in fact, Jackson and the Democrats did distribute the veto message. And you didn't, it is very technical, and there are sections that people probably glossed over, just like we do. But the populist, I mean, it begins with that anti-foreign. Everybody can understand that. If you're a scratch farmer, I don't think I want foreigners running our national bank. And then it ends on a very strong populist note. It was printed in verbatim in newspapers. Clay even stupidly distributed it himself because he thought it would aid his campaign. People would read it and say, "Oh, this is an outrage. I'm voting for Clay." Which is another reason why Clay was never president, because he was stupid, at least as far as presidential campaigns. So I think the answer is, again, it's a different age. People had more patience. People would go to, we all know the Lincoln Douglas debates. People go and stand in the hot sun and listen to, politicians talk for 2 or 3 hours at a throw and think nothing of it. They didn't have the distractions that we have today.
Yeah, it was entertainment. You didn't have movie houses and TVs and all of the other distractions we have. No iPhones so that was something that people looked forward to as a good rip-roaring political speech. And they listen to both sides, which today most people won't listen to the other side. They just ignore the other side and they listen to people who agree with them. So in many respects, I like that about this era. And Jackson, I think, was very good at mobilizing political opinion. It's clear he had a good sense of what the people actually believed, and maybe he's a little closer to the common man as opposed to someone like Clay and Webster, who were somewhat removed from the common man in many respects. And though I think they understood a lot about politics, but as you said, Clay made a terrible mistake on this issue, as he did during the 1844 campaign when he opposed the annexation of Texas. That was one of the things that got him into, really is one of the reasons why James K. Polk became president then, and not him. That was a very close election. So if he made the right decision on that one issue, I think he would have won the presidency easily in 1844. But once again, he made the wrong choice.
Was there any chance that Congress could have overridden Jackson's veto?
No, not at this stage. No way. There were enough Democrats in Congress they could never get to that number.
And indeed, Clay complained that the veto, the overriding of a veto, should be by a majority vote by Congress instead of the 3/4 vote that was required. So he recognized that they weren't going to be able to override it.
Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about what came next. You've mentioned the recession or depression that struck the country. Tell us more about the aftermath. First of all, actually, before we even get to that, you've alluded to this already. Would you say that on the whole, reaction to the veto address was favorable?
Oh yeah, definitely. It was very favorable. And one of the things that's clear is that if Jackson's very forceful comments about how that the elite are trying to run the country, and they're also benefiting in an outlandish way, an exaggerated way, through the passage of this bill and through the operations that they have control of financially, was something that associated the bank with these elite and was very helpful. And then, of course, once the election is over, one of the things that Jackson does is he begins to no longer send any of the national revenues of the government to the national bank anymore. He begins to send it to, as many of them referred to them as pets, Jackson's pets, the different state banks around the country that he favored. And so it was another way of just undermining the power of the national bank by cutting off its lifeblood, the money that it was receiving. So it was a really bad move on the part of Nicholas Biddle and the others to bring this issue up when they did.
Yeah, and the bank, I would just say the themes that Jackson touches on when he's not dealing with the constitutional issues that Dennis described, nativism and this class warfare stuff, much more in tune with the Jacksonian age, with the so-called age of the common man, and Jackson in many respects was very representative of this period. He was in fact a self-made man, and his passions were shared by lots of the farmers who made up the majority of the people of the United States at this time. So yeah, it was. I think that the veto and the reaction to it helped seal his reelection.
So counterfactual, had Clay and Biddle not made this political blunder in turning the bank into a political issue, and had they been willing to to allow a bill to go forward that allowed the bank to continue, but without the things that Jackson objected to most vehemently. The bank survives, but is it a good enough bank to do what a bank needed to do?
That's hard to say. Perhaps it depends on what the changes were, of course. And I do think that it was important to have an institution that was national, financial institution that would have some control over the state banks, because there are so many of them that were not well constituted by the state legislatures. And indeed, one of the big problems is you have all of this currency running around, state bank paper, which has different values. And so if you're someone in, say, Missouri, and you want to buy something from an Eastern merchant, you've got to convert your Missouri money to the Massachusetts money. And so it's just a very complicating factor to have this kind of a system going on for so long. And so I think that if they didn't break it into several different regional banks, which were independent of one another, which would have undermined the authority of having one national bank that could have some impact upon these state banks, it's probably would have been okay. I think one of the major things he wanted to do was make it open up the shares to the common person, to the bank, and also all the governance of the bank. Jackson wanted that to be opened up to more common men than to the elite. So I think that was the other aspect of it that he wanted.
Dan, anything?
Yeah, I don't know. I need to add. I mean, I agree with everything that Dennis said. I think that it's clear in 31, he was open to talking about approving a modified recharter along the lines that Dennis has just sketched. But once it became clear that they were going to use it, his foes were going to use it as a political issue against him, that was the end of that.
They misread him completely. They should have known better, having seen how he behaved earlier in his life. He was a very volatile individual who was very strong-willed, and he had power. I mean, he was the president of the United States, and he knew how to wield power. It's obvious. And he expanded the power of the presidency just through that, I guess, intuition that he had.
I mean, one of the great what ifs of this period is, what if Henry Clay had finally become president of the United States? Because of, I do think the American system was or his approach to economic development might have been able to tamp down some of the sectional tension that was constantly rising. But we'll never know, because every time Clay ran for the presidency, he did stupid things. I mean, his campaigns were always a disaster of his own making. As you pointed out, in 44, he totally bungles the annexation issue and ends up losing to the first dark horse, James K. Polk, and he bungles this in 32. I mean, he's just not a good candidate.
Well, in the few minutes we have remaining, I'm wondering if we could have something like a closing argument. We've got a group of 86 attendees currently, most, if not all of whom are teachers at the middle school or high school level. If you want to put forward the best case you can for why they should find room in their already jam-packed curricula to walk their students through this document, what would that argument be?
Go ahead, Dan.
I would just say that I think it's significant because of its populist themes. And, well, I guess two things. I don't want to steal all the thunder, give Dennis a chance to chime in here, but I think the populist message, in many respects, this could be regarded as the cradle of American populism, of the Jacksonian presidency, not only the bank veto, but other things that he did. but particularly the class warfare note that he ends on, where, the government shouldn't be turned. The rich already are rich. We don't need to bestow government favors upon them, and this kind of outrage. I mean, that's powerful stuff. And he injects it right into the body politic, and it's never left the body politic. It's part of I think I could make the argument as part of the Democratic Party's argument to this day. And you couple that with his approach to the presidency, and this bank veto is an example of that as well. You've got two reasons to talk about Jackson in class, I think.
Yeah, those are really good reasons. I think also just the fact that you have this constitutional debate that's very very common from this period of time. Everything goes back to constitutional issues, and so I think it's important to just keep in mind that these are the types of arguments that are going to be made right up through the Civil War, and part of it comes back to states' rights. And I think there is that theme that Jackson briefly refers to in his message as well. And so many of these ideas will be expanded by others, perhaps in ways that he didn't intend. But it really sets up, I think, for your classes, certain themes and issues that you can then expand upon and look at more in depth. And certainly one of those is the whole constitutional issue and how you interpret the Constitution and what Congress should be able to do under the Constitution, what the president should be able to do under and also the fact that the Supreme Court has a role and what is it and how powerful should the Supreme Court be? So all of these things are tied in there very nicely for you in this one document.
Right. I want to thank both of our panelists, Dan and Dennis, as well as our attendees for their great questions. As a reminder, you will be receiving an email within the next week, and that email will include a link for a certificate of participation. That email will also contain a link to the archived webinar. We certainly hope that you will share that link with your colleagues and put it out on social media. Do help us get the word out, please. If you have enjoyed tonight's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. As I said at the outset, both Dan and Dennis teach in that program. I am the chair of that program, so of course it's near and dear to my heart. You can find more information about the MAG program, our online course offerings, as well as all sorts of other resources for teachers at teachingamericanhistory.org. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will take place on Wednesday, February 17th, when our topic will be Alexander Stephens' 1861 cornerstone speech. Joining me to discuss it at that time will be Adam Seagrave of Arizona State University and David Tucker, Senior Fellow at the Ashbrook Center. We look forward to seeing you back here on the evening of Wednesday, February 17th. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free programs at teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org. And there you can also search our documents and documents-based resource libraries for teachers, students, and anyone else interested in American history and government. Thanks again.